What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be talking about possessed patients, and this is paranormal and or demonic encounters from hospital staff, EMTs, nurses, doctors, all of that really kind of creepy, in my opinion, super scary stuff. As someone who is around the dead and deals with death all the time, it takes a lot to scare me. Haunted houses, no problem. Creepy and possibly haunted cemeteries, bring it on. There's one place, though, that for some reason scares the living crap out of me. Pun intended, and that's hospitals. There is just something about a place that is filled with so much pain and suffering, death and dying, that just puts me in a state of absolute terror. The living suffer so much in these places, and then once the suffering is said or at least believed to be over, they're brought down to the morgue. I also can't handle the thought of being buried in the ground, even though I know for a fact the body is simply a shell and nobody, good or bad, stays in it. So the images of these deceased bodies being piled up in one of those freezer units just shakes me to my core. Do you get it yet? I'm petrified of hospitals. Even while giving birth to my kids in the maternity ward, one place in the hospital that is almost inherently a happy and peaceful place to be, had me not wanting to be alone at night, and whenever possible, I kept the baby in the room with me just to have some company. So you guys get the point, right? No hospitals for this chick unless absolutely necessary. I have friends who are nurses that have told me some insane stories, and I remember visiting my paternal grandmother in hospice. Oh my God, it was the actual worst, guys. The stories these brave men and women tell are just horrifying. I have one friend who's a nurse who sometimes can't wrap her head around some of the things I tell her, mainly about the visitations and the things I see lurking around her patients when I would go and pick her up for either lunch or coffee when I was in the area. Even when it never failed that I would be right about not only who would die next, but who would go peacefully and who wouldn't. I guess it just gives me some sort of like weird happiness when my friends recount their strange stories of things that have gone on with their patients, or even the random stories I encounter online from doctors, nurses, and other hospital and emergency medical staff. It's like a strange and oftentimes twisted, I'll admit, sense of vindication and satisfaction that they are, for a mere moment or two, experiencing what I experience on a regular basis. With all of that being said, I'm going to bring you guys some personal encounters from some of my friends who work in hospitals, and even some of them who have had experience in hospitals while being treated there. I'm working on a listener encounters of hospital experiences only. Until then, though, I have scoured the internet for what I believe to be the scariest and strangest, most fear-inducing experience had by hospital staff that I could find, for now. As always, expect a part 2 sometime in the near future. If you like this video, let me know in the comments and I'll give you more. Here they are, encounters in the hospital with possessed patients, demons, etc. Turning to religion isn't an uncommon thing when you work in a hospital, or so I've recently come to find out. Being religious myself, I guess I can see how it can bring a sense of not only comfort and peace, but of wisdom as well when encountering things that we know are from another realm or plane of existence and not knowing what to do with that information. Our first encounter takes place right here in New Jersey, in the hospital I actually had my youngest son in just 3.5 short years ago. There are similar stories all over the internet, but this one came from one of the nurses who, when I gave her an impromptu reading after my son was born, decided to tell me some of her horror stories from when she was new to the nursing field and long before she realized maternity was probably the best bet for a minimum amount of sadness and or death. It happens, mind you, in the maternity ward, but not so very often. So I'll call my friend Sarah. Sarah worked in the part of the hospital that held long-term care residents. All of them had some sort of ailment or another, and most were, while not terminal, not too far from death's door. Most of Sarah's patients were happy-go-lucky and kindly old people whose families would visit them often and take care of any outside needs that they may have. There was one patient we'll call Bob because, well, why not? Bob was a terribly grumpy and ornery old man who never had a kind word for anyone. Bob could always be counted upon to literally suck the light right out of any room he walked into. We all know people like this, right? Old and young alike, who, at the mere mention of their names, suck the absolute light and life out of you. Energy and spiritual vampires. Anyway, Bob was angsty and unkind, except when he was begging the nurses, always in the dead of night, to keep him alive and not let him die under any circumstances. It seemed he had some sort of irrational fear of dying. He would go crazy and scream at anyone who would listen, quote, "Don't let me die, please," end quote, whenever the smallest thing would come up. Sarah said she was once simply putting a Band-Aid on a small cut Bob had had on his knee, and he looked at her with tears streaming down his face and said, quote, "Sarah, please don't let me die," end quote. She assured him that he wasn't going to die as far as she knew and tried to comfort him as much as possible. This went on for months, with Bob screaming his eerie plea every time his heart monitor would so much as beep, which it did almost every night in the middle of the night. This went on for months and months until one night Bob took a turn for the worse, and quickly. When the nurses heard his monitor going crazy, they weren't prepared for the silence they heard aside from the monitor. Bob wasn't screaming this time. He wasn't screaming for them to keep him alive this time. This was the strangest and most concerning thing of all. Sarah thought for sure something had happened, so she ran as fast as she could into Bob's room and couldn't believe what she'd seen. Bob was levitated in a seated position about 4 inches above his bed. His eyes were completely black, and he had what she described as a, quote, "look of pure evil," end quote, on his face. He turned his head with a sinister smile and looked at the couple of nurses who had gone into the room to assist Sarah, and he said, quote, "You stupid bitches just aren't going to let him die, are you?" End quote. One of the nurses started to scream, and this seemed to snap Bob out of it because suddenly he fell back onto the bed and seemed simply to be asleep. The monitor stopped beeping and his vitals went back to normal. Sarah looked him over and tried to reconcile herself to what she had just seen. She's religious, but has a hard time when it comes to believing in the devil or demons or even the dead coming back as spirits. Scientific brained, I call her. The terror was far from done in Bob's room that night, as about 2 hours after this incident happened, he went into cardiac arrest and was pronounced dead by a doctor about 20 minutes later. As was normally the case, after the other staff immediately cleared the room, it was Sarah's responsibility to get the patient on a gurney and ready to be transported down into the morgue. Right as she was leaning over him to grab one thing or another that was left behind by the doctors and staff trying to save his life, Bob suddenly jumped up. This was about 5 or 7 minutes after he was just pronounced clinically dead. He looked at Sarah, his eyes as black as coal, and that evil smile returned. It was almost like the Joker smile from Batman, only somehow way more sinister looking. Black eyes blazing and staring straight into her soul, and an ear-to-ear grin which was almost unnaturally wide on his face. He said to her, quote, "You let him die. Oh well," end quote. Then he fell back, dead again, right onto the bed. Right when he fell back, the sound of a scream echoed through the whole ward. "Why did you let me die? I wasn't supposed to die." Then a horrible and agonizing, wordless, and almost animalistic scream echoed for what seemed like hours over and over again throughout the ward that night, and patients and staff alike all heard it. By the next day it was gone, but no one who worked there or had been there while all of this was happening, nobody who had actually seen what had happened to and with Bob, would ever be the same again. Sarah said she put in her transfer request the very next day and within a month was working in the maternity ward. She has several stories and encounters from there I want to share with you all too, maybe someday soon. Our next one is one I found on the internet that I thought would be a great fit here. It comes from a nurse in Minnesota working in the oncology unit of a hospital. The nurse had been given a patient who was unconscious for several days and was obviously on her way out. On the 3rd or 4th night, the nurse was doing her usual rounds and checking on all of her patients. She glanced into the unconscious and dying patient's room and, expecting her to still be knocked out, was shocked at what she saw. The patient was standing at the foot of her bed and the nurse walked slowly into the room, intent on helping her to lie back down. The woman looked her dead in the eyes and said, quote, "Please don't let them take me," end quote. The nurse said, "Don't let who take you?" And the woman replied, quote, "Those black things up there," end quote. She then pointed above her head. The nurse looked and didn't see anything and so went about trying to coax the patient back into her bed, which she finally did. About 15 minutes later, that same woman died. Her body just gave out. Natural causes, old age, whatever you want to call it, take your pick. The point is, as the nurse went running into the room, she heard a scream and a loud thump. She saw the deceased woman being dragged off of her bed by what could only be described as a, quote, "black mass of shadow," end quote. She blinked, and by the time she opened her eyes again, the patient seemed to be lying peacefully and still atop her bed as though nothing had ever happened. The nurse is adamant about what she saw, and it made her start going to church again after 25 years of giving up on organized religion. Nurses are definitely not the only ones to experience strange and oftentimes terrifying things while on the job and working in that type of setting. Our next encounter or experience comes from an EMT in Washington, D.C. Just like our two previous stories, this EMT's patient seemed to be unnaturally terrified of his own impending death. The EMT said he was out on a call and ended up being sent to this man's home. The man was in his early 40s and balding from chemo. He looked exceptionally frail and delicate, but had a booming scream when the EMT tried to coax him into walking back to the ambulance with him. The man would yell, quote, "Oh no, no, please, no, I don't want to die, I can't die," end quote. As he was screaming this, he was frantically looking all around the room. Even stranger still was that every few seconds or so, the man would swat the air as if there were some sort of fly or something nobody else could see bothering him about his face. Finally, they got him to sit on the stretcher, but he kept saying, at this point very low now, quote, "No, no, no, not now, please not now," end quote. For some reason, once the EMT got him outside and had stopped to talk to the patient's brother about something or other, the man jumped up off the gurney and crumpled to the floor in a big heap. He was completely still and hardly breathing. He had tears staining his cheeks and a morose look on his still and silent face. The EMT got him back on the stretcher and rushed him as quickly as he could to the nearest hospital. During the drive there, for some reason the EMT couldn't explain, he started wondering about what was going to happen to this man when or if he died. This was something he couldn't explain because he dealt with dead people and people on the brink of death every single night, and not once before had he ever pondered such a thing. This, though, is where he says the encounter took a turn for the weird. He said as he wondered if the man would go to heaven, a strange feeling started to creep over him. It was suddenly darker inside the ambulance than it had been before, and the air seemed heavier somehow than it was just moments ago. He explained it as though, quote, darkness was creeping all around us, with us being him and the now deceased man. He stated, quote, I happened to look down at the voltmeter and I saw the number 666 flashing. This panel normally doesn't flash at all, it just reads voltage. It went 666, then 0.1, then 666, then 0.1, then 666, then 0.1, and then it went back up to 1200 or so and stayed that way. The uneasy feeling went away, but I still prayed the whole way to the hospital, end quote. So just a little side note, in case some of you are unfamiliar, we in the Christian faith, most of us, believe that 666 is like the mark of the beast. It really means incomplete, as God's number is 7, and on the 7th day he rested. We associate the number with evil, and this is mainly due to a passage in the book of Revelation. In Revelation 13:15 through 18, in the New International Version, it reads, quote, the second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666, end quote. Now, while I am in no way fanatical about this number, I don't like to see it. The other day, it was my number on my sandwich receipt for Wawa, and I was pretty upset about it. There's just something about it, but not trying to start a religious debate or whatever in the comments, just educating those of you who may not be familiar. Come for me if you wanna. Y'all know where I stay at. Anyways, let's do one more and then end on that note. Again, part 2s and 3s only if you all let me know you want more of anything new I may be covering like this here. In Fresno County, California, in the summer of 2015, at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, brings us our next EMT encounter with the paranormal, and this time possibly demonic. The call was to a dark and extremely rural farm from where a call had come in about a suicide hanging. When they arrived, though, they didn't get what they expected at all. The 34-year-old man who had allegedly hung himself was very much alive and standing there talking to sheriff's deputies who were already on the scene. The man himself was a bit strange, though, dressed all in black from head to toe and having deep lacerations from his attempted suicide. It gets weirder. The man had tried to hang himself with what the EMT would later describe as in, quote, oddly large, wicked-looking gray skeleton of a tree, end quote, which was on the almost unnaturally dark and somehow sinister farm. It was decided the young man should be taken in for treatment, and he was also restrained for his own safety. Or so they like to say, but I'm not even going to comment, okay? They started up the ambulance, and once they reached the main road, which again we have being described as almost unnaturally dark and unusually heavy, this is what the EMT had to say. Quote, "On the way to the hospital, a few good miles down the road, we made a wrong turn, got a little lost, and took a back road. He was quiet and trembling. He wasn't fighting the restraints. He almost seemed to feel safer in the back of the ambulance while I got this bone-cold chill down my spine. I looked out the window and saw this house. Mind you, every house is acres apart from one another. Well, the house was okay like the others, looked normal. But next to this house was this big tree/bush, and in a separate tone and position, this old four-door sedan was parked. The car looked out of place and was clearly separated from the house and tree/bush. It was like it was its own place, its own entity entirely. It was odd and it was creepy. I could normally see in the car's cab and see the headrest of the driver's seat from afar, but this car was pitch black on the inside, almost as if the darkness was coming out of the windows because it was the deepest and darkest black I've ever seen on the inside. All I saw inside was the deepest and darkest black and two neon dark blue eyes staring back at me a little above where a tall and big man's eyes would be in a car. Immediately, I felt the back of the ambulance get colder and the goosebumps and hair on my skin stood up. At first, I thought it was a security light or reflection in the car, but as we passed the house, the car turned on, pulled out, and started following us in the ambulance. The neon blue eyes were still there and the cab was still dark as can be. The car followed us miles to the highway, still with the eyes staring and deepest, darkest black in the cab. Even with the street lights, I could not see into this car but for the neon eyes. I was almost mystified by this and forgot about my patient in the ambulance and partner, but I did not at all feel welcomed by these neon dark blue eyes. It was almost threatening and felt as if it wanted my patient somehow. We were on the highway and this car was still following us almost plus 20 miles now. The neon dark eyes were still there, and even with the highway lights, I could not see into this car. It got colder. It started to feel as if it noticed me watching and was watching and focusing on me now instead of focusing on my patient. The car then sped up and pulled up to the next ambulance in the next lane while we were driving and looked at me. I was very literally 5 feet from this car and could not see into the cab from the window. All I could see were those dark neon blue eyes and darkness. But it wasn't looking ahead, it was looking at me. And in that moment, out of nowhere, I said out loud, challenging it, quote, "Go away. You are not touching this man. This man is my patient, and if you want him, you'll have to come through me. I'm stronger than you, and I will not let you have him," end of quote. After I said that, not even a moment later, the car and my ambulance split off as it went on one off-ramp and I did the other. It was no longer cold in the ambulance, and my patient was no longer gray in the cheeks, but now his cheeks were pink and normal. It wasn't until after the call and we got the patient inside the hospital when I realized what had just happened. I truly feel and felt that whatever the deep neon blue eyes thing was not human and that it wanted this man, end of quote. What do you guys think of that? Because I thought that it was like because the guy tried to take his own life, something was lurking about waiting for his soul. And when he accidentally didn't succeed, it was kind of still waiting for what it came for. Obviously, I believe it all for several reasons. Mainly, though, it's just that I never discount anyone else's experiences, not after all I've encountered and seen and been through in my life. Being called a liar hurts and makes things 100 times worse. Were the encounters with actual demonic entities or even Satan himself in the last one? Has anything like this ever happened to you? I'd love to hear about it. Send it in. That's all I have for you today, guys. Please be sure and give this video a big thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already, and spread the love by sharing this video. I'm a little amped up because I haven't filmed in a couple of weeks, and I'm like, yes, it's so good to be back. If you haven't already, please go on over and subscribe to MoonBearOracle. It's my other channel where I was going to be doing once a month readings for each astrological sign, my intuitive oracle readings, but that would just be way too much on my plate right now. But I'm still doing some pretty awesome crystal, candle, herb magic, council of light, collective consciousness, all that type of stuff, the Christian mystic type stuff that I do over there. Gemstone of the month is coming up, and eventually I'll get to the monthlies and weeklies that is my main and ultimate goal with MoonBearOracle. But please go on over, show me some love, subscribe to the channel. And if you want a personal intuitive oracle reading with me, it's usually 7 to 12 or 15 cards. Please email me at moonbearoracle@gmail.com. That's moonbearoracle, all one word, @gmail.com. On Wednesday nights, right here on Gemma Jade, live from 7:15 to around 11 p.m. Eastern Time, I pull one intuitive oracle card and give a weekly reading for anyone and everyone who comes into my live stream. First come, first serve. Usually my 17-year-old son Damien has been joining me. It's been a really, really fun time. Please come on in, feel free. I would love to give you a 1-card weekly reading. I enjoy doing it. It's really awesome for me. Also, if you have any encounters like this or with the supernatural and or paranormal that you would like me to make a part of my listener encounter series, please email them to me at GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. GemmaJadeParanormal, all one word, @gmail.com. I have to figure out how to write on the screen with this editing software. Guys, it's all a process, right? Still fixing up my office, still figuring out the software, still but you know what? I'm trying my best. I'm doing the very best I can for you guys. Check me out on the weekends, Friday nights on Paranormal Chop Shop. I haven't been there in a while due to scheduling conflict, but I still am a part of that show. That is still my show with Sunny and Chad, Papa Willie, and whoever else is over there and hanging out. I'm trying to get something together with Sunny where either he and I or he or I are interviewing people on another day of the weekend. So we'll figure that out. On Saturday and Sunday nights from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. Eastern Time, you can find me on Spaced Out Radio. We Own the Night, myself, Big Willie Townsend, and the fedora-wearing John Hudson, where we discuss all things woo. Climb aboard the woo train. I will leave links to each one of those live streams in the description box. Ways to donate to the channel: Patreon, PayPal, Cash App, Amazon wishlist, gift link. Thank you guys so much for all of your donations. You have no idea how much it helps. Really, really, truly, especially right now with things going on in my life, the donations really make a huge difference and really matter to me, just like you guys do. Be kind to each other. It doesn't cost anything. Make sure you're being kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. Always keep your side of the street clean. Always go in grace. Smile at a stranger, and I will see you